Several years ago, I wrote a short story that I actually used as a sermon, which was focused on how Christ has triumphed over the great enemy of our old evil foe, the devil. And in this short story which I proclaimed, the story was kind of a fantasy retelling of this great triumph of Christ. The story was entitled The Dragon Slayer. Today in our epistle reading, and also last week in our epistle reading, we are reminded that not only has Christ triumphed over the devil, he's also triumphed over the great enemy, the enemy of death. And so this morning, I present to you another story, the Shadow Slayer. The garden glowed brightly as iridescent beams of light cascaded down from the majestic mountain. The prince and princess of the great high king dwelt in the garden, enjoying the comforts of its beauty. On many occasions, the great high king would descend from his glorious dwelling and walk with the prince and princess in the garden of light. He loved them so very much, and they loved him. But then came the dark descent. The children of the great high king were not content dwelling below the mountain. Instead, they longed to reign on high, seated on their own thrones of glory. This poisonous illusion had been slipped into their minds by the great deceiver, the dark dragon, who himself had once dwelt on high as a knight of the great king's high court. He and his legion of fallen knights had been purged from their high places at the time of the great rebellion. The dark dragon had tainted the hearts of the prince and princess, who now, in their lust for glory, had carelessly consumed the one object that the great high king had withheld from them in the garden, the forbidden fruit. Their descent into darkness had begun. When the high king later discovered his fallen creatures hiding in shame in the garden, his anger burned brightly, and yet he loved them too much to destroy them for their disobedience. However, there would still need to be consequences for their rebellion. The prince and the princess were banished from the garden of light, never to return. They would become peasants, dwelling in the land below the majestic mountain. Their lives would forever be filled with conflict and strife. Turmoil and trouble, sorrow and suffering would never cease. Worse still, a new darkness would descend upon the land, an inescapable, all-encompassing darkness, the dark shadow of death. And as a shadow extinguishes every glimmer of light, death would extinguish every glimmer of life from the prince and princess and all of their offspring for generations to come. The shadow of death would forever enshroud the world in darkness. Since the dark descent in the garden, death has prowled around the lands beneath the majestic mountain, consuming and devouring all of life like a ravenous predator. Like a beast whose appetite cannot be satisfied, death hunts, death stalks, death slays. Death descends upon its victims like an inescapable dark shadow. And once the shadow enfolds its prey, the light cannot overcome it. Sometimes death comes slowly, like a shadowy serpent, patiently swallowing its prey, bite by bite, inch by inch, slowly consuming, slowly constricting, slowly crushing the life out of its victim until life dies and death lives. Sometimes death comes quickly, suddenly, like a flash of darkness that instantly hides the light from its victims, trapping them in a thick shadow. Sometimes death plays with its prey, partially devouring them only later to release them from its sinister clutches. And when the victim allows the hope of life to return, celebrating their victory over death, death cruelly snatches a hold of them once again, crushing their spirit and plunging them into an even deeper darkness until their final breath is squeezed out of the suffocating body. Death enjoys the pain it inflicts. Nothing excites it more than to hear the agonizing screams of the earth dwellers as they watch their loved ones being ripped away from them by the darkness. With sadistic delight, death gleefully revels in the anguish, the inconsolable sorrow, the heart-rending separation that the dark shadow brings to the mortals below the majestic mountain. And make no mistakes, death plays no favorites. It is not prejudice. It is not picky or selective. Death devours kings and queens, the prosperous and the poor, young and old, every man, woman, and child. Death knows no boundaries. It moves freely from land to land, country to country, village to village, city to city, street to street, home to home. There is no place that death cannot and does not go. Without fail, the shadow of death comes to all those who dwell below the majestic mountain. Ever since the dark descent in the garden, death has callously consumed millions and millions and millions of earth dwellers. Only 2, with the help of the great high king, have ever been saved from the shadow that death casts. A man named Enoch, who legend says walked with the king and was no more, and Elijah the prophet of old, who was carried off to the majestic mountain in a flaming chariot. No one else has ever escaped the dark shadow. Death is arrogant and proud. Death is afraid of no one, for death has no enemies. At least that's what death thought. But he couldn't have been more wrong. The dark dragon had once warned death that the great high king had promised to send a mighty warrior who would fight to save the earth dwellers from his dark and deadly talons. But death arrogantly refused to believe that he could ever be defeated. That was until it came to pass that one day the great high king kept his promise and sent forth the one who would put death in the grave, the one who would destroy the darkness of death forever, the shadow slayer. But death was not afraid. He was way too powerful to be overcome by anything or anyone. But what death did not realize was that the shadow slayer was actually the son of the great high king himself. For it was the son of the king, and only the son, who could put an end to death's tyrannic reign. It was the son, and only the son, who could kill death. Death attempted to devour the shadow slayer at the very beginning of his life below the mountain. A wicked king of earth, who was possessed with a jealous lust for power, tried to kill the son of the great high king. But a knight of the court of light thwarted his plans by whisking the tiny shadow slayer away in safety. Although death's thirst for death was slightly quenched as children of a nearby village were slaughtered at the hands of the evil king, he was enraged at having missed out on the life he desired the most. For 30 years, death, like a skilled hunter, patiently stalked his prey, waiting for the right moment to strike. He almost claimed victory when people from a village attempted to throw the son of the Most High King off a cliff. But the son walked away unscathed, and death's jaws snapped shut empty. To make matters worse, the shadow slayer on a few occasions did the unthinkable. He reached down into the mouth of death, grabbed a hold of his recent victims, and breathed into them new life. A young girl the daughter of a sanctuary caretaker, a young boy, the only son of a widow, and a young man who had left behind 2 grieving sisters. All of them were snatched from death's strong grasp before he even had time to digest them in the darkness. It was as if the shadow slayer was mocking death, taunting death, challenging death. But death would not be trifled with. Someday he would devour the shadow slayer like he had done so many times before, and he would enjoy it very much. That day arrived much sooner than death expected. The Son of the Most High entered the city of the kings, who had long since been buried under the dark shadow. The city was rife with those who, possessed by the dark dragon, were thirsting for the blood of the Son. A deep darkness descended upon the city as the Son of the King was arrested. No knights from the court of light were called to rescue him. He allowed himself to be harassed, mistreated, and abused. When the soldiers whipped him mercilessly, death was invigorated. He felt alive. Like a wild beast who smells blood, death was stirred up into a frenetic frenzy. When they led the Son of the King out of the city, death almost fainted with joy. For they led him to the most treasured spot of all, a place enshrouded in the darkest shadow that has ever been cast down upon the earth, an outcropping of rocks, the hill of the skull. There in the center of the hill was death's favorite instrument of torture, the dark tree. They took the Son of the Most High King and they drove nails into his flesh, pinning him to the dark tree like some grotesque decoration, and death loved every minute of it. With each ping of the hammer, death shuddered in delight, for he knew that it was just a matter of time. Soon the supposed shadow slayer would be extinguished by the darkness he had come to destroy. As it turned out, death did not have to wait long, only a few hours to claim his greatest victim. And yet death was confused by the strange turn of events. It had almost been too easy. Most earth dwellers resist death. They struggle against him. They go kicking and screaming, begging for one more day, one more hour. Most victims who are impaled upon the dark tree writhe in pain for several days. But the Son of the Most High King offered no resistance. He just surrendered to death's cruel clutches. No matter. That was fine with death. He had won the victory, and that was all that mattered. The great High King had failed. His rescue attempt had been aborted. The peasants of the earth would forever dwell in the shadow of darkness. Death would always have his way, and the dark dragon would feast on their souls forever. Never before had the deep cauldron of fire below the earth shaken so much in celebration of death. The dark dragon and his legion of fallen knights patted death on the back. For 3 days, death was the life of the party. But something happened on that 3rd day. For some reason, death didn't feel right. Something was wrong. Death began to feel out of sorts. He felt sick. He felt weak. Death felt something he had never felt before. Death felt like he was dying. Then an unexpected visitor arrived. The shadow slayer descended into the cauldron of fire. He subdued the dark dragon, placing his foot squarely upon his scaly snout, and began crushing his sinister skull. He then grabbed death by the throat, lifted him off the ground, and looked at him straight in the eyes. Pure radiating light poured out from the Son of the Most High, and that light pierced the dark flesh of death, and he felt himself being ripped apart. Never had the shadow been so terrified by light. Never had death been so afraid of life. The Son of the Most High King, in a voice that shook the halls of hell, roared, "You lose! I have walked through the valley of your dark shadow, and yet now I live again. I have risen. I have destroyed your sinister sting, O death. And death knew exactly what he meant. If the Son of the Most High King had died in a darkness that he did not deserve, then he had taken the place of those who dwelt upon the earth from the first prince and princess until now. And if he had taken their place, then there would be no punishment for them to experience in the deep cauldron of fire. And if the Son of the Most High rose from the dead, then death had lost its power. There was no need to fear him, because the shadow slayer had given his people a way out of darkness. He had given them light. No longer would they be called peasants. They would be sons and daughters, children of the great high king. Death was crippled. Though he would still be allowed to swallow up the king's children, though he could still inflict pain and suffering, though he could still separate the people from their loved ones, though he could still drag the earth dwellers into his dark valley and bury them in the ground, death knew that those graves would be shallow. Death knew that all the victims had to do was look up to the majestic mountain, believe in the Son of the Most High King, and trust. Trust that because he had hung on the dark tree, he had forgiven their disobedience and rebellion and cleansed their darkened hearts with the radiating light of his love. All they had to do was to trust that the shadow slayer had defeated death. If they did that, then death knew he could bring them to the grave, but he could not keep them there. Their stay in the valley of the dark shadow would only be but for a fleeting moment. Death had lost, and great was his defeat. Still today, even though he continues to prowl around like a hungry beast, death knows that his days are numbered. For one day, the Son of the Most High will descend again from the majestic mountain. He will come and scatter the pure, radiating light of his love, the light that brings life, over the entire land. The light will reach every corner of the earth, everywhere there is darkness, and that light will completely, once and for all, overcome darkness and everything that dwells within. Which means on that day, the light of the shadow slayer will destroy death once and for all. As the children of the great and most high King dwell below the majestic mountain, awaiting that great and glorious day, they gather together at a living spring of sacred waters, a gift from the great high King, a gift that washes and refreshes them in the knowledge of the great King's love. They join together in a sacred feast of celebration and victory, and they tell the story of their great deliverance. They tell the story over and over again. They never grow tired of telling their children and their children's children about the one who triumphed over the great enemy of death below the majestic mountain. And when this enemy attacks, when death snatches away their loved ones, and they are torn apart by grief and sorrow, they mourn. But they do not lose hope, for they know the one who shines the light of life into the valley of darkness. With joy and peace in their hearts, they can look into the eyes of death, and with great courage shout one word, one little word, a word that sends chills down death's decaying neck. And that word, Shadow Slayer. And so it has come to pass, and so it is written. May it be forever believed. May it be forever told. Amen. May the peace of God, which transcends all our human understanding, keep our hearts and minds in Christ Jesus until life everlasting. Amen.